America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. To serve others in ways that promote human flourishing and create a ripple effect of transformation for generations to come. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Broback.
And this week, we are not covering a novel. We are not covering a short story. We have a special guest. And we could not be more excited. Our guest is someone whose name you've heard so many times on this podcast before because he is an invaluable resource to us as one of the foremost scholars of Agatha Christie. That would be John Curran, who has 2 books currently to his name, both of which, again, we have used just shamelessly on this podcast to try to make sense of Christie's mystery puzzling
process.
Yeah, her process and what might have been going on in her brain when she was concocting these puzzle mysteries. And I can only reference the autobiography of Agatha Christie so much, you know? Occasionally, I have to go to a secondary text.
I mean, Kemper, I think some of us have wondered in the past if there is a limit to how many times you can reference Agatha Christie's autobiography. But we are all very glad for the work that John Curran has done, especially in the archives, both to add, I think, insight into what we're talking about and to eliminate long quotes from the autobiography on this particular podcast.
Yes, just for that alone, he has he has definitely saved you from some autobiographical meanderings. So his first book was Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, 50 Years of Mysteries in the Making. And really, if you're a listener of this podcast, you should read this book because it deep dives into the notebooks that Agatha Christie kept throughout her life, in which she made notes and worked out the plots and characters and puzzles for her novels. And it brings just such a deeper level of understanding to how she did what she did, and also just what she was doing, because he has a lot of information in here that we have not found anywhere else. So that's the first book. And then he also wrote a follow-up book to that called Agatha Christie's Murder in the Making, More Stories and Secrets from Her Notebooks. And it's just more of all of the wonderful information that he served up in the first volume. These volumes also feature some previously unpublished short stories.
Right.
These books were also my source for that preface that Agatha Christie wrote to the serialized version of Appointment with Death, in which she talks about her relationship with Hercule Poirot. I could not find that on Google, believe it or not. Could only find it in Mr. Curran's books.
And I think that he has just done a wonderful job as essentially a literary historian, finding the narrative through the archives.
Yeah.
We just could not appreciate these books more as not just resources for this podcast, but as interesting literary historical works in and of themselves.
Absolutely. We should also note that we spoke with Mr. Curran over the telephone, and the voice quality came out a bit harsher and more tinny than we hoped. We'll be working on that in future interview episodes, which we hope to do more often, so please bear with us for now. Let's proceed to have a discussion about all things Christie.
Great.
Our first question for you, John, is that in reading your book, Agatha Christie's Notebooks, you make all these references to ideas that Agatha Christie scribbled down in her notebooks, which didn't become novels or short stories. And you highlighted some of them. The one that we really enjoyed was this Detection Club murder mystery that could have featured Ariadne Oliver, since we've had our own fanfic sort of fantasizing about Ariadne Oliver and Raymond West.
Another very intriguing idea, a bit along the lines of the Detection Club, is the Cluedo murder.
What is that one?
I'm not sure. I think in the US you call the board game Clue.
Yes, sure.
This side of the Atlantic is called Cluedo, and she was plotting a murder using the characters of Cluedo. So she talks about Professor Plum and Colonel Mustard and Miss Scarlet, who I think I remember saying she was a young lady of loose morals and maybe she could be Professor Plum's secretary. So for whatever reason she didn't pursue this, but she has quite extensive notes about it in one of the notebooks around about the early 50s, because Cluedo I think went on the market at the end of the 40s. So it would have been the ultimate combination of the greatest mystery writer ever and the greatest whodunit board game ever, combining forces to come up with something, well, hopefully very intriguing. So I don't know why she abandoned that, but that would have been a real classic Agatha Christie, I like to think.
Yeah.
I mean, as people who are fans of the 1980s film adaptation of said board game, that would certainly have been intriguing.
Yeah, and I think...
certainly would, although I don't think it really captured the essence of the board game.
Not so much.
It's quite funny in places, but...
Yes, I did it. I killed Yvette. I hated her so much. It flames on the side of my face, heaving breaths.
But I suppose the other thing that intrigued me about that was that Agatha Christie was aware of that, because the board game wouldn't have been that very familiar at the time.
Yeah, that's obviously a branding fantasy. I think these days there are so many movies that are based on board games. Like Hasbro has essentially built an empire just based off of their board game brands. I don't think anyone would be able to resist the idea of Agatha Christie doing Clue. That would only be more attractive, I think, in today's environment than it would have been back then.
It would have been wonderful, and she'd obviously given it quite a lot of thought, because the notes are relatively extensive, 2 or 3 pages of them, but sadly that's as far as it got. The other small idea that I find really intriguing, and I wonder how she would have managed it, you may not remember because it's only a very short suggestion. We all know in, for instance, A Mirror Cracked from Side to Side and 3-act tragedy, poisoning at some sort of reception or a party. But she was trying to work out some system where the person to whom the drink is handed is the killer.
Interesting. It seems to be something that she did enjoy doing, right? Setting up a technical difficulty for herself and then figuring her way out of it. And then there were none.
Yes,
was concocted that way, right?
Managed to do very, very successfully on many occasions.
Yeah.
But that's quite an intriguing short idea.
That is very intriguing.
Now, poison was her favourite murder method.
Of course.
We were talking about the killers who can sort of self-inoculate so as to also look like victims. And so, I mean, I think it's interesting every time it's used.
Oh, it is, absolutely. She managed to do most of her plot ideas more than once, and yet she managed to disguise them so successfully that very few people actually realise them. They go back and analyse them in more detail.
Yeah, and I think you even quoted in your book, she has Ariadne Oliver acknowledging that fact, right? When Poirot says, well, you wrote 2 books that were essentially the same book, they're just in a different setting and a different murder, and she says, oh yes, how clever of you, that's totally true. I do that all the time.
I love that, because I think that's Agatha Christie being a sort of metafictional, if you like. I'm wondering how many of her readers will spot the same thing.
Oh, she is so metafictional with her authors. We've been tracking that very closely since it's obviously of great interest as we're rereading, and something that I think you don't pick up on as much in your first read. But even back to Death in the Cloud, she has that first sort of proto Ariadne Oliver author who she uses to poke fun at how she walks around. Muttering to herself, and then Ariadne,
even quite a figure of fun.
Yes.
I don't mean fun as in witty and entertaining like Ariadne Oliver. She writes them almost to be pitied.
Yes, no, it's true.
I don't think she wanted to portray him as a detective novelist of the Golden Age type.
I think that she's always trying to do something self-deprecating whenever an author appears in her stories, because having read her autobiography, self-deprecating humor or humor at her own expense just seems to be something she's very into as a person. So I think that was always her goal, so to speak, when those characters appear on the page. And it's mainly charming. Sometimes it can be a little odd, perhaps in that case it was, but it's mainly entertaining and provides these light moments that I think often work within the overall mysteries.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's something to be said about self-deprecation masking inherent insecurity, isn't there?
Yes, and again, she says in her autobiography about the fact that she's a rather good writer of detective fiction. But and I think that's the point exactly, Catherine. And of course, I always try to bear in mind that she was a Victorian, and she was a Victorian female, which is even a step worse again, if you like, because blowing your own trumpet as a female would not be what she was brought up to do, and I think she carried that right through.
Yeah. Yeah, there's almost an apologetic air sometimes at this, this fame. Let's be honest, she achieved fame and fortune to an extent that was almost unprecedented. And there almost seems to be this air of apology and embarrassment about it, and legitimate embarrassment. It's really interesting.
I agree, absolutely. Not only did she not go to university, she didn't go to school.
Right, she was homeschooled, right?
Which is quite stunning. The human being who sold more books than anyone in history never went to school.
And had to teach herself to read, right? Her mother had this crazy idea.
I have to say, nobody admires Agatha Christie more than I do, but I don't believe anyone can teach themselves to read. If I was faced with a room load of books written in Japanese in pre-internet days, how would you teach yourself to read them?
It's a good question.
Perhaps the biggest mystery of all.
Some help from somebody along the line. You just can't. I mean, they're hieroglyphics on a page unless you get some help. So
we had a really specific question for you, which has to do with 3 novels that we have already covered on this podcast. And those would be 3-Act Tragedy, Death in the Clouds, and the ABC Murders, because you wrote in your book that they all conceal the killer in similar surrounds. And we weren't exactly sure what you meant by that, because we made the point on our podcast that 3-Act Tragedy and the ABC Murders essentially hinge on the same plot twist, which is an early murder obfuscating the later true murder, or the crucial murder, if you want to call it that. Yeah. But that's not really the case for Death in the Clouds. Of course, we do have the fact that we have a murderer dressing up as a servant in Death in the Clouds, and also 3-Act Tragedy. And there's an element of that in the ABC Murders, but it's not quite the murderer who's doing that. It's part of the sort of overall obfuscation in that novel. So we just weren't sure what you meant by that. And since it's 3 novels we've covered.
What I meant there was the fact that in each case, the murderer is a member of Poirot's little band of helpers.
Oh, okay.
So Charles is helping him.
Got it.
Norman, Gale, and Jane in Death in the Clouds, they're both helping in inverted commas all the time. And he has a little band of helpers, suspects from ABC Murders, and in each case, the murderer turns out to be one of those.
One of his helpers. Oh, yeah. It's more of a fundamental principle than we were even thinking of. Well, I'm glad that we asked that question, because as often happens, it was a simple answer that was just escaping us.
Yes.
So,
like the best Agatha Christie's.
Exactly. So this is a fine point, but a really fascinating one that you got at in your book. A little bit of detective work you did yourself to get to the conclusion that Sleeping Murder, which, as most listeners will know, is Agatha Christie's final published novel, but was a novel that she had written much earlier in her career and essentially put in a vault to be published at a later date. This was her final marple. The sort of apocryphal telling of it is that it was written during World War II, right? That's definitely what I had thought as a more casual fan.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And I think people like the romance of imagining the bombs going off during the Blitz, and Agatha Christie feverishly writing a Poirot and Marple novel and thinking she might not live to see another day. But it seems that Sleeping Murder was actually written closer to 1950 than 1940. And what particularly interested me about your point is that you think that may account for its not being quite as good.
Well, I never, from the day that I first read Sleeping Murder, I never considered it amongst the type of book that she was writing at the peak of her career. I don't know whether you agree or not with that.
Obviously, as you know, our project here is rereading her canon in order. So we haven't gotten, we certainly haven't gotten to it yet, nor will we get to it within years.
Well, I just feel that there's nothing stunningly clever about the book, as there is, for instance, about Curtain, which is just one stunning conjuring trick after another. So I was very disappointed with it, and even at the time, I remember saying to people, anyone who would listen to me, that I found it very difficult to believe that was something that she had written at the height of her powers. So I have received a certain amount of flack from fans about what I came up with Sleeping Murder, But I can't see any other explanation for the fact that there are two dates written in the notebooks, inside the notes for Sleeping Murder, dated 1947 and 48, or 48 and 49, I can't remember which now. So I can't think of anything else that would explain those dates unless she was writing it in 1948. But I think the other point that is overlooked in all of this, if she was writing Sleeping Murder at the same time as Curtain, which was written in 1940, why would she be writing The Last Miss Marple at that point, when there had only been one Miss Marple novel?
Yeah.
Well, two. One really, because it was just Vicarage and 13 Problems.
Right.
So at that stage, Miss Marple wasn't a serious character. But by 1948, she would have added Body in the Library and Moving Finger. So it makes slightly more sense that she would be writing the last, in inverted commas.
Right. No, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, and she still had obviously many more Marples to go, even after writing, even if Sleeping Murder was written in 48, she still had a lot more Marples after that. But she also had a lot more Poirots after she wrote Curtain, obviously. So
you could understand her writing the last Poirot in 1940 because Poirot had quite a glittering career up to then.
Oh, yeah.
Miss Marple had barely made a dent on the publishing world or her fans or readers' perception. So, again, I think that backs up the 1948 argument. But also, towards the end of Sleeping Murder, she talks about the poison pen letters at Limstock, which is 1943.
Right.
So how could she do that in 1940?
Right. No, I think I think you lay out the case beautifully. What I'm curious about is the notion that she perhaps had a peak in her career and that she was already on the decline. And I'm wondering, and I know this is also opinion. There's no objective answer here as to whether or not Christie's writing peaked at a certain point. But do you think that there was a point at which her writing hit an all-time high in the 40s?
I think it was around the time of World War II, certainly late 30s into the early 40s, probably. I mean, if you look back at the books just between 1930 and 1940, not one of them fall below the standard of excellence, because they're all in that decade. There isn't a mishit anywhere in that decade.
Yeah.
The book that I don't understand in that decade is Height and They Ask Evan, because it doesn't, although it's a very clever, light-hearted thriller, it doesn't fit in with the rest of them at all, but that's another argument. So I would say, even if her writing started to decline, we say from the mid-40s on, it was still wonderful compared to many of her contemporaries. But it just never, it didn't reach the peak of Orient Express, ABC Murders, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, and Then There Were None, which are all, if she's never written another word, we still talk about Agatha Christie for those books alone. Right. So while I greatly admire later books, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, After the Funeral, Pale Horse, they're all much later. For me, they're not in the same category of clever intricacy as Orient Express or Lord Edward Dies or ABC Murders.
Right.
You see the point I'm trying to make?
Oh, no. Yeah.
There isn't an edifice of clues and alibis and very clever reader deception.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. It's interesting to me because Christie herself, as obviously you know, pointed to in a couple of different places, either from fans asking her or at one point in her autobiography, she mentions what she thinks her best titles are. And she picks out Ordeal by Innocence and Crooked House and even The Moving Finger, interestingly. And you have in your second book that you wrote, Agatha Christie's list of her favorite short stories that she wrote out when she was much older, which is quite honestly a shocking list because it includes all of these little-known supernatural tales that most casual fans have never read and don't see them at all like her. She seems to value sometimes not so much her mystery puzzling, but more of the atmospherics that she pulls off. And it's interesting because I tend to agree with you. I think if I had to identify, and we're still working our way through, but it seems like we're approaching her peak. And we've been having a really good run of novels through the 30s. We just covered Appointment with Death we're about to get to Hercule Poirot's Christmas. Obviously, we have And Then There Were None coming up, and it's mind blowing, honestly, how she just churned out hit after hit.
Absolutely, sometimes in the same year.
Yeah, or 2-3 times in the same year. But she, it's just interesting that she doesn't seem to identify that as her peak. She seems to be perhaps oriented just differently and a little bit later. And every Christie fan obviously has their own opinion as to what her best titles are, but I just find that interesting.
Absolutely. I do think Ordeal by Innocence was an interesting one for her to choose. I was surprised when I read that, but I think what intrigued her there is the idea of justice and the fact that until justice takes place, everyone suffers.
Yeah.
Something that seems integral to at least like Poirot in particular's psyche, right? And Miss Marple. I mean, we talked about it at Murder at the Vicarage, that it seems to be a driving concern.
Yes, her predilection for the innocent, the airing of grievances, and the reconstructing of life for those who have been affected by a murder but are innocent preoccupies her, I think. Certainly preoccupies Poirot, but preoccupies her more than enacting revenge or punishment on the murderer.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's why I think that she chose Ordeal by Innocence, because that's the book in which she explores that in greater detail than any of her other books. And of course, the type of book she was writing in the 30s didn't really do that, apart from the fact that justice has to be done and seen to be done.
One of my favorite Agatha Christie books, although temper definitely differs in opinion with me on this. Let's 5 Little Pigs.
Don't set me up as a 5 Little Pigs hater here. I'm not a hater. I just don't love it to the insane extent of Catherine. But John, I believe you also love 5 Little Pigs.
Well, I do, but I was like, this sounds like an AA meeting or something. I used to like it, but what changed my mind was the notes for 5 Little Pigs, because there are more notes for 5 Little Pigs than almost any other book, and every single thing about the book changes between the early notes and the final product. The characters' names, their relationships, the murder method. Even when she decides on a poison, it's a different poison that she eventually settles on. And I presume, are you familiar with Robert Barnard's book, Talent to Deceive?
No, actually, I'm not. I don't. Catherine, are you? No.
Oh, you should. But he, at the time, it was 1980, it was published, he sees parallels between the setup in 5 Little Pigs and Agatha Christie's personal life with Archie Christie, even pointing out, and I don't agree with his theory, but it is quite intriguing, that the man in 5 Little Pigs, Amyas Crail, has the same initials as Archie Christie.
True.
And Amyas is a philanderer.
Oh, yeah.
And Amyas thought about his own destruction, if you like, by his carry-on. But that was intriguing. I actually don't go along with it. But I do think that 5 Little Pigs is the closest Agatha Christie came to a crime novel and a detective novel, as distinct from a detective story where it's just clues and alibis and suspects and Poirot gathering everyone together. I think it's a deeply felt book, and it packs quite an emotional wallop. Years ago, when I first read 5 Little Pigs, I found it quite disappointing, because it is quite different to most Agatha Christie up to that point. But I'm now a firm believer in 5 Little Pigs, so I'm on the same wavelength as you on this one, Catherine.
Thank you very much, John.
But we are voices crying in a wilderness, I'm afraid.
That actually, you identified the ABC Murders as another of your favorite titles, and 5 Little Pigs. I'm just curious, is there one other Christie title or a handful of other Christie titles that you absolutely love?
First of all, I think everyone's favourites change as the years go on, and you read and reread, and I think that's certainly what happened to Agatha Christie when she came up with that bizarre list towards the end of her life.
Yeah.
But I remember the very first interview type setup that I did after Secret Notebooks was published. One of the questions on the floor was, what's your favourite Agatha Christie and what's the best Agatha Christie? And I actually said, well, that's really true, because most people assume that your favourite is the best, but that's not necessarily true. So I think, technically speaking, a book like Roger Ackroyd or Orient Express are amongst her best books. My own personal Desert Island favourite would be Five Little Pigs. But I think the ABC Murders, for its sheer bravenness of fooling the reader, has to be must get up at the top. Because I remember when I was reading it, I was so disappointed because I thought, what's she playing at? She's telling us who the killer is. Although at the back of my mind I kept thinking, but Agatha Christie wouldn't do that, so there must be something extra. And then when you get the answer, it is so simple. Yeah, I think the ABC Murders, because it's not the first example of a serial killer novel, but it's a very early example. But to me, it's still the best example.
Yeah, no, she's doing so much in that novel, and it's so interesting. And I think it's an unsung Christie, because I didn't appreciate it until we reread it for this podcast. I had certainly read it at some point, but I just passed it over, and I think a lot of people do for whatever reason. But there is a lot going on in that novel, and I believe it's going to be adapted. It's actually next up for BBC adaptation. Well, and that's a perfect segue to our next question, because we're curious how you feel about David Suchet's portrayal of Poirot. Just to give you a sense, we adore it, but in rewatching certain episodes directly after reading the novels, we did notice that in the later seasons especially, Suchet and the producers seem to have this obsession with Poirot's fundamental loneliness and unhappiness, and there's just there's a darker tone, and there's a sort of crabbiness to Poirot and Suchet's portrayal of him that is interesting. And
in general, I would agree with that, because, as you know, there was a gap of about 5 years in which it looked like we were never going to see any more. And they came back. The first one after they came back was Five Little Pigs, and I knew immediately there was a whole change of tone. It was darker in every sense of the word, and all that banter with Hastings was gone, so there was no banter with Hastings, and there was no chap, and there was no Miss Lemon. So yes, there was a distinct change of tone, and certainly by about the last 4 episodes, it's gone pretty much off the rails. I mean, I hate his version of Orient Express.
Yeah, I don't hate it, but it's certainly, they made a decision, and they went in a very specific direction with it, and they went hard. And if you don't like that, it makes the whole thing a mess.
Labors of Hercules is a complete disaster.
Most of the early Poirot, the bantery, light Hastings Poirot, those are all short story adaptations.
Well, yes, they were, but then they did a lot of the novels later. They did 2 series they did about 24 episodes of the short stories, and then they moved on to the novels. And they did, one of the first novels they did was Styles, which I thought was superb. But the later ones then, I suppose they were running out of good material, because they were left with things like Elephants Can Remember, and the Big Four.
Right.
They were in the last batch, and in fairness, I don't think anyone could have done anything to redeem either of those books. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that.
No, I think they did a good job of salvaging what could be salvaged out of the Big Four, and the changes that were made I certainly didn't mind, because the Big Four is just it's a bit of a Frankenstein's monster of a novel anyway, right? In that it's just short stories all stitched together in a hurry. I agree with that. I mean, we did. After our Death on the Nile episode, I came down rather hard on the decisions that Suchet made in Murder on the Orient Express to make Poirot as tortured as he was, which is certainly not in the text. However, there is this sense of darkness and loneliness in the text in Death on the Nile, which is absolutely warranted, I think, in the adaptation, and does work quite well in the Suchet adaptation of Death on the Nile. Actually, that's a fairly later one, and I thought that one worked well. So I think I understand why he made those decisions as an actor. But
would you that the Suchet version of Death on the Nile is as dark as the Suchet version of Orient Express, would you? Or would you?
No, I would not.
No.
I would not. No. I think that
That's mostly by virtue of the ending, right? On Murder on the Orient Express.
Yes. But I just found the ending, as they did it on David Suchet, was just ridiculous. I mean, he's literally 10 minutes before the ending, he's screaming at the assembled suspects, "No, that I'm going to tell the truth. The truth wins out. Justice must be done." And then they're all standing there waiting for the axe to fall, and he walks over in the most pathetic snow I've ever seen on the screen, and he doesn't say a word. And we're never given any reason why he changed his mind from his hysterical fit 5 minutes before. So it was just the logic of it that got me, because we all know he wasn't going to let the cat out of the bag.
Right.
So I don't know why they went through all that rigmarole.
Right. Yes.
But anyway, I get very angry when I think about Orient Express right, on the screen, because the 1974 version is never going to be bettered.
How do you feel about Albert Finney's portrayal?
Well, that's the only problem I have with that 1974 film. Albert Finney, for most of it, needs subtitles. It's so difficult to know what he's saying. But it's the only fault I would find. Otherwise, that film is a perfect Christie adaptation if you're going to find. Would you agree? Or
the Albert Finney portrayal was certainly our biggest issue when we rewatched the 74 version too. And then the highlight, oddly enough, of course, is Ingrid Bergman, who is not necessarily the highlight in the book that, of course, she is in the film version.
I think the inverse about the Murder on the Orient Express movie, in that there are things about Albert Finney's performance that I like, because I think that it breaks up what to me feels like a rather plotting, and that's plotting with 2 Ds, portrayal of a story. I think it's a little boring. I think that it's a little staid. I mean, I had that problem overall with Murder on the Orient Express in rereading it. It's one of the novels, it's one of those Christie crown jewel novels that is obviously brilliant and one of her best, but not the best reread, because once you know what's happening, there's a lot to churn through there, and if that reveal is not a surprise, it can feel a little tedious. So that's one other thing that we've accidentally come across, which are the best Christie rereads, and to my surprise, I think I would say Murder on the Orient Express was one of the worst experiences when it came to that.
really?
Yeah.
Oh, because I reread it there around the time the film was released at the end of last year, and I totally enjoyed it, because I like picking up references or phrases or sentences that suddenly take on a whole new meaning when you know the solution.
Yeah, that can, for whatever reason, there was a tedium to it, and I think it's so enclosed. They're obviously stuck on a train that's not moving. It didn't trip along the way that it did on the first read. But in any case, we also wanted to touch on with you, this is something we don't talk about often enough on the podcast, but Christie was obviously not just a short story writer and a novelist, but also a playwright, and one of the most successful playwrights ever. One of the things that we do in preparation for the podcast is we have a Google alert for Agatha Christie that we check periodically. And I would say 9 out of, maybe not 9 out of 10, maybe like 7 out of 10 of the Google alerts we receive for her are about amateur productions of her plays that are just constantly being put on all over the world. Yes. Dozens of them at any...
I get the same Google alert every day.
Yeah, just dozens of them at any one time. And it's really such a testament to all of the plays that she created. And that, I think, also is part of the secret as to why she endures as much as she does. It's not just the novels. It's also these plays, which are so beloved and constantly being put up in, small and large venues. My sort of hot 2-second take on the plays is that most people know The Mousetrap because that, of course, is the longest run on the West End. It's the most famous, arguably the most famous. I've seen The Mousetrap. We, of course, are not going to talk about the intricacies of the Mousetrap plot. I'm not particularly impressed by The Mousetrap. I think that it's serviceable and it does its job well and it's charming, but it's certainly not Christie at her brilliant best. And which is interesting that The Mousetrap is as well known and successful as it is. And then Witness for the Prosecution, I would say, is probably her best play, or at least is brilliant. But there's a lot in between there. And, a lot of her novels she adapted as plays, and then she had some original plays that she wrote. And I'm just curious if there are any other standouts that you would point to as Christie plays a fan should know about.
Well, I think from the originals, the one she wrote directly for the stage, I think Spider's Web, because it's a comedy thriller, but it has enough of each to make that description justifiable. It's full of clever ideas. Have you seen it, by the way, before I go any further?
No, not at all.
Oh, Captain, have you?
No, I have not.
Oh, but you have read the script, have you?
I may have at one point, but I'm really not that familiar with Spider's Web.
Oh, sharp intake of breath, and that's shocking. It is full of clever Christie-like ideas. Now, I point out in whichever secret notebooks book, ideas that she uses that have appeared in short stories and novels prior to that. And whether she was recycling them consciously or subconsciously, we'll never know. But it is a very clever play with keeps the suspicion going between the half dozen characters. And it also has quite an amount of comedy. The Clarissa, the main character, is genuinely funny and entertaining. And if you've never seen the BBC Penelope Keith version of it, you have to. It's just been released on DVD. It's hugely entertaining and it's very clever. The other play that I admire is The Hollow.
Oh.
I was going to ask you about that. That's really interesting, especially as an adaptation.
It's very much Agatha Christie country, the country house murder mystery. The guests are assembled for the weekend, and we have the murder and then the investigation. In the UK, there has been for the last 10 or 12 years the Agatha Christie Theatre Company, and that was their first production when they began life about 12 years ago. And they did a version of it. They skewed the set. It was literally on a slant because the director, because I got to know the director, and he said, well, he saw that as the end of the country house party era, because it was just after the Second World War when society changed forever as a result, and the days of the house party were drawing to a close. So I think he made a very good point throughout the production, because Agatha Christie herself veered away from country house parties largely after that point. Again, I think the central situation, the emotional entanglement at the centre of the plot is very convincing and very gripping, and Agatha Christie plays a lot with it. Now, you could argue both in novel and in book that the murderer is kept off stage for a little bit too long, but there is a clever idea. And one other one, if you've never read, you may not be aware of this, but when she adapted Appointment with Death, she changed the killer.
Yes, that is the last novel that we covered, and we were fascinated by it. I love when she changes. I think she also technically did that in Chimneys. In this, didn't she? Did she change the killer in the Secret of Chimneys adaptation? Not quite as robust of a mystery in that one, but
no.
But
I would argue that the ending that she gave, the play version of Appointment with Death, is much better than the novel.
Yes. No,
psychologically, it's much more convincing.
Well, and given that novel is so much about psychology, I think a little bit to its detriment. I think for me, there's a little too much musing about psychology and the effect of this one woman's influence on her family over and over and over again. But that feels like a more appropriate ending for what had actually been going on there. I agree 100%.
Absolutely,
yeah. I love when she seems to improve upon her ending. But I have to say, we talked about this in our Witness for the Prosecution episode, and she talks about how she really fought for that altered ending in Witness for the Prosecution because other people didn't want it. And we both love the ending of the short story. How do you feel about the ending of the play for that one?
Well, I love the ending, and I can still remember as a schoolboy reading the Witness for the Prosecution, and it was like a kick in the teeth when you get to the last line, and it is literally the last line of the story. But I think she did a wonderful job with the stage play because she has not just two, but three twists at the end of it. And I find them all convincing. They are acceptable because it's running in London at the moment, a new stage version. Well, not new, but they're doing it in a courtroom, essentially. But people in the audience around me, I could hear them gasping as the last few lines were being said. So even after all this time, there are people out there who don't know the ending of Witness for the Prosecution.
Right.
So it still stands up, and I don't think it strains credulity at all. But you obviously do you? Yeah.
The ending of the short story is, kick in the teeth is a perfect way of describing it, and I think having that single twist that just reframes the whole thing is so powerful that it's impressive that she's adding twist upon twist upon twist, but it also, to me, takes away from the power of that single kick.
Well, I think the other thing that you need to bear in mind is, morally, I don't think she would have been let have the ending of the story on the stage. Because you know the way it's like the Hayes office in old Hollywood movies, a couple in a bedroom, one of them had to have a foot on the floor. To keep the Hayes cold happy. So be it. I don't think she would have been allowed by the Lord Chamberlain of the UK have a story in which someone got away with it.
Right. And that's a similar issue with And Then There Were None. I think I had always been baffled as a more casual reader as to why none of the adaptations, and this was before the BBC adaptation came out, but why none of the adaptations seemed to stick with the wonderfully bleak ending of that novel. But of course, she changed it herself, right, in her play adaptation.
And it's even more understandable then because when it premiered on the stage, it was during the Blitz. People were being killed by the hundreds every day of the week. So it was far too downbeat an ending for that.
I don't think they wanted to watch a play in which everyone also dies on the stage. Yeah, that makes sense. So on another note, we actually referenced you quite a bit in our episode on Dumb Witness, which I'm sad to say was not. I think that was a rare novel of the 30s that did not work as well as most of those other novels in the 30s. And I think reading the unpublished short story that you appended in your book, to me, it feels like one of the problems with that novel is that it's essentially a bloated version of that short story. We have that whole first section, which basically gets repeated after Poirot and Hastings get this letter, and then they go back into this town and essentially relearn everything that we've already learned. It just feels unnecessary, and I know that there was some theorizing that the reason why is that Christie just needed to expand the book for American serialization.
Yes, that is the reason, because I've seen there's a letter in the archive where she talks about adding to the beginning of it.
But are we coming down too hard on Dumb Witness? How do you feel about that novel?
No, I can see exactly what you're saying, and I wouldn't argue against it, because what you're saying is correct. But I still love the book. But again, this may be because it was the first Agatha Christie I borrowed from the public library. That was quite a big deal to get to. I don't know how the system works in America, but you have a junior ticket for so many years, and then you're allowed to join the senior library. And the first book I borrowed on my senior ticket was Dumb Witness, and I remember coming home and reading it, sitting in the back garden. So I have a great affection for that book, even though I would quite agree with you, there is quite a lot of padding in it. But I have to say, I enjoyed and still enjoy the padding.
And we do too. I mean, all of our critiquing is within the context of, obviously, we've created a podcast about Christie, so we enjoy every single word that she wrote. But it just, when we're speaking relatively, it certainly doesn't feel like it's one of her masterpieces.
No, it's not one of her masterpieces. Although I do think the criminal is conceived quite well. Would you agree?
It's funny that you say that, because there was one point that we didn't cover on that episode, which is that I do think so, because it is very gutsy of her that the first time we are introduced to our murderer in that case, which is Bella Tanios, she is a mother of two. And it's not just reference that she's a mother of two. We see her constantly with her children. Her children are drawing Mickey Mouse. She is portrayed as a devoted mother. We see her children, and that is surprising that she turns out to be the murderer. No, that's true.
And I also think in that book, Christie is quite clever, and in many ways it answers some of her critics in dealing with the foreign husband. The foreign is an inverted kind of...
we agreed totally on that. He ends up being the good guy.
The reader does a complete about-face about the doctor in that.
Yeah. Well, that actually brings us to a point that we struggle with a lot and that we discuss a lot on the podcast. We call it the stuck in its time elements of Christie's writing when it comes to the xenophobia. It's often anti-Semitism. There's a lot that jars for certainly a 21st century reader that one has to assume would not have jarred for a contemporary reader of Christie's time, and that she was writing as very much as a person of her time, which is why calling it stuck in its time is our way of acknowledging the context there. We felt like we had to at least bring this up with you because it's something that just comes up constantly with readers today. How do you feel about it? How do you deal with it? What's your take?
At the most basic level, I would agree with you. It is of its time, and that accounts for a large amount of it. But the other thing that sometimes annoys me about people is they assume that if Agatha Christie puts an anti-Semitic remark into the dialogue of a character, that's Agatha Christie speaking, which of course is complete nonsense, because she may well have been putting an anti-Semitic remark into the mouth of a character to make us realize that this is a nasty character. Absolutely.
And that's something I think that gets completely lost in the conversation, because people see the word or they see the remark and their eyes go red, and then they lose that nuance 100%.
Yeah, completely. And a couple of other points there. A lot of her contemporaries, I know this is no defense, but a lot of them are far worse Also, alone of her contemporaries, Agatha Christie was the most widely travelled. So dealing with foreigners, in inverted commas again, was what she did frequently throughout her life, right up to the time she was an elderly lady. So she would have far more personal experience of foreigners, inverted commas again. And there are passages in her autobiography and in Come Tell Me How You Live, which quite clearly show that she loved, for instance, the firm she worked with, Max Manuel, on the archaeological digs. She loved that whole way of life, and she had great respect for all of the people who worked on the digs, and they would have been the natives of the area where they were living and working. So I don't think it's really fair to say that about her, because of all of the writers at that time, I think she was the most even-handed in dealing with that situation. I also would agree, as would you, I think she doesn't get it right all of the time.
No.
I suppose the most obvious example is, well, you haven't come to it yet, but it's Midge in The Hollow, when she rings her employer to say that she can't go back to work on Monday because she was involved in a murder. Her employer is a Jewess who owns a dress shop, and Midge is one of the girls who worked in the shop. That would be one example, but throughout whatever number of books and short stories, I don't think she commits that sin too often at all.
Yeah, the worst instances and the instances where it seems to most obviously come from Christie herself often, unfortunately, seem to be anti-Semitism. A lot of this sort of...
Carol at End House is another obvious example that it actually fits into the plot of it.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true, yeah.
I just had a question, a short story focused question, because it was pretty clear to me from reading your book that The Labors of Hercules is your favorite short story collection. But as the Miss Marple fanatic among the pair of us, I'm curious if there are any other standout short stories for you, and in particular Miss Marple, because Christie herself opined that Miss Marple's purest state was in the short story form, and she put the 13 Problems on that rather bizarre list late in her life of her favorite short stories. So are there any Marple short stories near and dear to your heart?
I would tend to agree with her about 13 Problems, because I think that the essence of Miss Marple is in the 13 Problems. I mean, I love some of the novels as well, but most of those short stories she adapted and changed, but she adapted a plot device into a novel in many cases, because most of them are very, very clever short stories. And there's also a great span of, some of them are light-hearted, like Motive versus Opportunity. It's clever, but it's not a very serious one.
Yeah, and the companion is probably the most famously adapted into A Murder Is Announced.
Well,
elements of it, sure. There's a lot more going on in A Murder Is Announced than is going on in the companion.
And The Bloodstained Pavement, same. A lot of that was used in, well, even on the Sun, I suppose, is the most obvious example. But and then the very first one, The Tuesday Nightclub, that went on to become Pocketful of Rye to a large extent. So I think that it's a whole storehouse of ideas in the 13 Problems. But The Labors of Hercules would be my Desert Island short story collection, definitely.
Five Little Pigs, Desert Island novel, Labors of Hercules, Desert Island short story collection. Good to know.
And if I was allowed a Miss Marple, it would be Murder Is Announced.
Yeah, I'm very excited, actually, to get to that one. A lot of people have referenced that one as a favorite, and I remember quite enjoying it the first time around. So, yeah. I just have one other question for you, because this is something that has bedeviled us a bit in covering Christie titles more closely. Most casual fans are familiar with the fact that sometimes there would be a title change between the UK and the US title of a book, but there are some Christie novels that have 3, if not 4, alternate titles, because there was often a title change when the book was first serialized in a newspaper. They would call it something else. Then there's a UK novel title, then a US novel title. Sometimes there's a US serialization. And this is even the case not just for the novels, but the short stories. A lot of those Tuesday Night Club murders were alternately titled in the US. Is this just marketers doing their job too eagerly and thinking, I can do this better than she can and I have a better title for my audience? Why all of the title changes?
I don't think there's any one reason for it. I think part of the reason, certainly for the changes in the novels between the US and the UK, because so many of her books have nursery rhyme titles, I always suspected that the Americans didn't have the same nursery rhymes. Maybe I'm wrong.
We do, but I think that's a fair point, because I think that they are probably not as widely known for Americans as they are for a UK audience.
Yeah, I think so. And then things like 450 from Paddington. Well, everybody now knows Paddington, and millions of people have been through Paddington. But when she was publishing that in the late 1950s, and there was no such thing as Google, that would have meant nothing, am I not right in saying, to most Americans.
Right, like they would have been like, what's Paddington?
Yeah,
they didn't know that
exactly.
it was a train station, right?
Yeah, so I think sometimes it was just a purely practical reason. But then I think also that magazine editors just like to wield the blue pencil and their power a little bit. And because it was such a lucrative market, even Agatha Christie was happy to let them do whatever they wanted. But I have to say, she was very unaware of her own titles, because I've seen letters when she would write back to somebody talking about my novel, The 240 to Paddington.
Really?
Well, I suppose when you consider the amount of material she produced, it would begin to gel after a while.
Oh, at a certain point, I feel like that even doing this podcast, there's so many Christie titles swimming around in my head. It's overwhelming.
Yeah, and as you say, then the short stories are probably even worse. Because, well, I don't know if you're familiar with Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, but they published, I'd say that over the years, they published all of Agatha Christie's short stories. But if you read background material on most writers, they would say they were quite very happy to be published in the Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. But Ellery Queen had a fetish for changing titles. I mean, that's just what he did. So because it was a prestigious magazine, it paid a little bit more than most other magazines, they just agreed to the title changes. So I suppose if you're a working author, you're not going to balk at a change of a word or two if it means a couple of $100.
I get that. She often made, it seems like early in her career, she often made more money off of the serialization rights than royalties, right?
Absolutely. When you look at the amount of money she was getting in the 1930s, that was why she put in the extra few chapters at the beginning of Dumb Witness. I mean, $18,000 in 1936.
That's not nothing now.
No, exactly. That's exactly the point I made when I came across it, yeah. So what was worth a lot more than that 80 years ago.
Well, that was a fantastic discussion with Mr. Curran. I have to say I had high expectations, and I think my expectations were exceeded.
I completely agree. And I think that we're very excited to bring him back on again in the near future, because, listener, you may be surprised to hear this, but we didn't even make it through about half of our question list.
Yeah, we really didn't. We had so many questions for him. We will 100% be having him back on. We're so thankful that he took the time to speak with us and lend his wisdom and his expertise on all things Christie. We so appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Curran. And next week, we will be covering our next novel, which is Hercule Poirot's Christmas. And fittingly enough, with Hercule Poirot in the title, this is our final Poirot of the 1930s. We have done 9 in a row. This is number 9. Christmas is also in the title, and it is June. That's okay. I think we'll be okay, because this title has very little actually to do with Christmas. So if you're feeling like, I don't want to read a book with Christmas in the title, it's hot out, this just doesn't feel right, I would say have no fear, dear listener.
Christmas is not here.
Christmas is not within these pages. So it is all right to be reading it in the sunshine. It's practically a beach read.
Provided you like your beach reads with a heavy dose of blood.
Some people do. Stephen King on the beach, you know.
I certainly can appreciate that.
All right. Well, in the meantime, we would love to hear from you, as we always do. Our email address is allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame, or find Catherine at Brobcat. We're also on Facebook. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and we're on Instagram at All About Agatha. And we would love it if you would take a moment to rate and review us. It helps us out. It helps other people find the podcast. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.